Good morning, everyone. Great to see everybody here. We are going to begin our Bible study. We've got a 4-week Bible study with Mr. Bergdolt. Everybody give it up for Kurt. I'm very excited about this study. We're taking just a quick little break from our study of Romans. We will return to Romans after this Bible study. But we're taking a little break because Kurt is our artist in residence. He's not our only artist, but he is an artist in the congregation. He previously served on the faculty of Concordia, Portland, Oregon, until that school unfortunately closed. But so he's done an awful lot of work, high school, also college. He's continuing to teach, but he is designing a lot of the furniture, the liturgical furniture that's going to go into our new sanctuary. He, along with a group on a committee, because what do Lutherans do? We form committees. On the art committee, they are working with the Center for Liturgical Arts over at Concordia, Seward, Nebraska, to also develop some of the, or to make some of the pieces of art that are going to go into the new sanctuary. So I'll let Mr. Bergdolt introduce how he's going to attack this topic for the next 4 weeks, but it will, it's my understanding, include some of what's going into our sanctuary as well. Okay. All right, give it up again.
Okay, thank you. I have moved from the college ranks to the K-12 teaching, so I don't have to worry about discipline today, right? People aren't going to be running around laying on the tables, doing the windshield wiper thing. So, that's what I deal with every day. But no, school has started. We've got through the first 2 days out of Weeping Water, and it's nice. You have the kids; they know you now, and we don't have to go through our expectations just as we do any other time. So here's my expectation for you. Listen, ask questions, and if I can't answer them, I'll refer to Holly. I'll ask if she'll, or Pastor will. But again, a lot of the times, this is an artist speaking. I did go to Concordia. I am on the roster. I have my 9 hours and of Christian doctrine. But there are things that sometimes we get into hot water sometimes as artists because we see things differently. But hopefully, I'm not going to take us down those roads, right? So, but what I'd like to talk about first is there we go. When we speak about art, we usually have a different concept of what people thought of art in the past ages. So in the past, most art in the ancient world really centered around religion. And so you made art for religion. The art that you saw in religious buildings were typically things that instructed the people. Most of the people were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. And so as they went into the church, they didn't have access to the Bible that they could read and read those stories. And so the pictures on the walls became those stories. And so those stories instructed the people for better or for worse. But like we talk about, a lot of times, images are always open to interpretation. And so if that interpretation isn't quite correct, then we might be thinking about things in a different way. Okay? Yeah, I know. And moving around, right? Yeah. Okay. So when we talk about the art of God, or we talk about art that's influenced by God, we usually mean creation or the world around us, or we think about the complexity of our existence. But we speak of artists as having creativity, of the creative process, of God working through the artist, either through inspiration or talent. God certainly gives us the ability to make art, to craft useful objects, and build shelters for ourselves. But issues arise when humans make the assumption that we are, as they refer to Mozart, the stylist of God. Okay, so yes, God works through me. I believe that as a Christian. But at the same time, do I have this direct link to God? Is God speaking to me directly saying, I'll put the dot here, or make the shape of this there? I don't think that that's happening. At least it doesn't happen for me, right? So, but the only biblical record we talk about with God giving direct inspiration for the creation of objects is found in Exodus 31. And the Lord said to Moses, he said, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I filled him with the Spirit of God, with the ability and with intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, and cutting stones for settings, and in carving wood, to work in every craft. And behold, I have appointed with him Oholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and I have given to all able men ability that they may make all that I commanded you." And so in that case, God calls or commissions this artist to make the word. But before the Renaissance, art was considered in the same realms as art and crafts, with artists having the same social standing as plumbers and carpenters and wheelwrights. They typically sat on the same table as those people. They weren't really elevated. Creativity was not seen as a special gift. People were not, put into this lofty status. But after the Renaissance, art became this work of an inspired, lofty artist. It was a higher calling, a human activity that began to have this spiritual and religious quality. It was removed from the everyday living, and it became something that started to exist outside of reality in life. And something that these artists or the authors in the book called it a luxury. It's refined, but it's typically useless. And so, we might say, okay, art is useless. Well, in a definition of art, a lot of times when I talk about it, we talk about, well, what other use does it have except for its visual qualities? And if something has those visual qualities, and that's what you're relying on above all, then in that case, we consider it art. But as a potter, woodworker, whatever, sometimes we run into issues with this because, if I make a pot, it can be used for something, but then it can also be looked upon for its visual quality. So I tell my students a lot, how am I treating it at this moment? Do I take that piece of pottery that I made, do I put it on a shelf, do I appreciate it for its visual qualities, or is it being used? And in the same way, liturgical furniture, liturgical furnishings, how do I treat those, and for what purpose do I treat them? And I think we get into whether things are sacred or whether things are used for everyday use, like the profane things that are just normally used for things. And in that same way, I think art and the sacred use of objects becomes somewhat similar. And so here we have two works of art in churches that were used for very different purposes. The Apostolic Stone and Saint Apollinaire in class, it's by Ravenna, Italy, depicts the transfiguration of Christ. And so, as the picture on the left, you have the saint on the bottom of the apse, the circle surrounded by the sheep down there, who is Saint Apollinaire. And he has his hands raised in supplication. And above him is this orb, the circle with the cross in the middle of it. And if we could see this, which we really can't very well, it's not a big enough picture, but in the middle of that cross there is a figure of Christ, a picture of Christ. And it's similar to what Pastor Will was talking about, Christ as Pantocrator, has his fingers in the two-finger benediction, and he is coming, he is being transfigured at this time. And we know that it's a transfiguration because, and I'm going to move around a little bit up here so the people in class here can see this. But in this area, you have these three sheep, and those three sheep are Peter, James, and John, who accompanied Jesus to the Mount of Transfiguration. Up in this area, you have Moses and Elijah, and they're identified by their Greek names. And they are sitting here. They have also joined on the Mount of Transfiguration. Now, up at the top, which you really can't hardly see here, but if you look really closely, there's a hand pointing down to heaven. And that creating hand of God is there, and he is in his presence, and everyone's there. So you have this piece that's really depicting this transformational moment, this transfiguration, and the theory behind it, the reason it was created into this mosaic is that they believe that worship you were in effect kind of part of this transfiguration. You were outside of time. You were outside of, you were in a different place, basically, as you as you were in the church worshiping, right? And so the next piece, though, the one right next to it, is by Bernini, and it is in a small chapel, but it depicts something completely different. And so this is the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Saint Teresa was a nun, and through her fervent meditations, she began to experience visions, and during those visions, she would levitate, according to tradition, right? And so here you have her floating in the midst of one of these rapturous visions. And she talked about in her writings how during her meditations, she was so filled with love for God that it was almost as if she was being pierced by an arrow. And so this is what that fiction is, this angel over to the side is piercing her with this golden arrow. And so really two different things. So what type of art do we look to see in our own churches, right? Do we want something that, transfixes us, moves us, puts us in this place where we're not quite on earth and not quite in heaven and sort of in between? Or do we look on things of these experiences of people that have happened? Now, again, both of these are firmly rooted in, one is more rooted in the Orthodox tradition, one is more rooted in the Roman Catholic tradition. But both of these exist in worship spaces fairly prominently, right? So some thoughts that we talk about concerning Christian art. So in the first part, only God is holy. So things that we talk about, things that we include, things that we have in the church, we don't necessarily consider them holy in and of themselves. So when we talk about things that were in the tabernacle, and we'll get to talk about that in a little bit, God talked about how those things were made holy through certain anointing oils, through the presence of God with them. But our objects that we create in and of themselves are not holy or sacred until we use them in that sacred way. So a friend of mine, Phil Brandt, who is one of the theology profs out at Concordia, Portland, always used to say, well, for instance, like my TV, if I use it for profane things, then it's a profane object. If I use it for sacred things, it becomes a sacred object. So again, it's that usage of how we use these things that makes them either sacred or profane. So in the Bible, for instance, we talk about how Jacob in Genesis 28, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on earth, which is top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. When Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. And so Bethel means the house of God. So in here, Jacob has taken this stone and he has, taken it from this ordinary object and turned it into something different. He has set it upright, he selected it. And I think there's a contrast there too between how the ancient people at that time who didn't believe in the God that we believe in would have done something differently to it. Instead of this stone that was found in nature, they may have dressed it, they would have cut it, they would have shaped it, and they would have formed it into some sort of altar. But Jacob just sets this up. This was his mark, his remembrance of this dream. And so he said, this is a sacred place. And so one of the big words that people use for that is hierophany, where God breaks through into our daily existence and something has happened, has come to us in a vision or something like that. So a lot of the time, these hierophanies, they talk about, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for instance, they consider some of those things to be in that same realm. But another example from the Old Testament is the bronze snake. And so when we hear that in Numbers 21, they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died. And the people came to Moses and said, we've sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. pray that the Lord will take these snakes away from us. So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. So Moses made a bronze snake, put it up on a pole, and when anyone was bit by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, it lived. So again, this profound or profane object, the snake, this creature, becomes the thing that has that life-giving power to it because God makes it sacred, right? So, and we also talk about too how when God instructed the Israelites not to use those tools in His altars because of the connection with the Canaanites. A lot of these things, again, are set apart, and so we set apart objects that we use in church. God sets apart His people to do these things that are different from what the Canaanites would have done. We don't have that practice of, we don't sacrifice our children, for instance, like the Canaanites did. So we want to set ourselves apart in our worship practices as well, right? So that's the important thing.
So I have a question for the group, if that's okay. First of all, I know some of you have, especially during the teenage years, wanted to sacrifice your children. I understand that. Just start over fresh and new, but so I have a question. What objects that are profane, that are just everyday use objects, do we use in Christian worship today in a sacred sense because God's presence is there, because He promises it is, and we're using those objects that way? The what? The bread and wine. So what's the difference between going to Olive Garden and coming to church? They have bread and wine at Olive Garden. Is that the Lord's Supper you're eating?
Consecrated.
Okay, but we consecrated because we're remembering God's promise to be there, right? What's another object we use in worship that's everyday use? Water. Hopefully, every single one of you used water this morning to bathe. Okay. When we use water that way in church, that's not the same use, is it? No, it's not. So just trying to pick up on where you're going, Mr. Bergdolt.
Exactly, and that's good because sometimes I get on track here and I should bring that in. No, thank you very much. But and he does, and even the objects that we see in there, the vessels that we use, although they don't have the, it's interesting too, the different practices about being an elder. I was once an elder here at church too, but we talk about that, like what do you do with the wine that's been consecrated? I don't know how we do it here now, but in the past, we poured it back in the bottle, right? In my brother's congregation, the elders, they drink it, they consume it, and they don't reuse it. So it's just, and those are I guess those things that we would call adiaphora, things that are not going to get us into heaven or keep us out of heaven, right? So these are just these different practices that we would put forward, right? So when we talk about things that we see in liturgical art, it'll either speak in visual terms or it will not speak at all. And so when we use art within the church, we have reason and senses. And so to think about the meaning of this work, you have to use your senses to see how things are coming together. So we use our reason to interpret or create the meaning based upon the physical elements that we see. And so art involves the senses. It involves this nonverbal communication that's hopefully speaks to us as we're looking at it. So as I've been thinking about this presentation too, I keep looking at those banners that are up in church that we made years and years ago. And I think about that too, how when they were first put up, someone came up to me and said, could you talk about what the meaning is behind that? Because I'm really not quite sure what's happening there. And so that's something that we'll talk about too, is that those symbolism might be there, but unless we talk about it or explain it, it may not always be clear to people. So, and that I want to say that for a little bit, how that's going to be coming up here too. So every time we have a visual form, from architecture to furnishings, they say something. Okay, we may have this idea that we want to put forth for it. We may have an idea for what we want it to say, and sometimes it says that, and sometimes people come up with new ways of looking at it. And honestly, sometimes those are things that the artist didn't think about. One of my professors in art school said that too. You may not know until years later, when you've been living with this work, what it actually means. You might not know why you created it this way, and then the answer may come to you as you live with the work. So work takes a little bit of living to kind of get used to it. So at times, the simplicity of the work, though, speaks louder and more deeply than trying to say everything at once. If I tried to, spell it all out and explain it all, or use, symbols that we know, but yet keep putting those on there, maybe that doesn't, get me to look more deeply at what I'm seeing, or maybe it doesn't involve my sense to be able to understand what's going on. So this baptismal font cover here that you can see next to those stained glass windows, it's round, it's bronze, it has this sort of satin sheen to it. The placement of this, and I know where this is at. I was looking for a couple images last night, came across this, and 3 of my children were baptized at this very font and in St. Louis. But the cover of the font, they're placed in the center of the aisle as you approach the stairs leading to the communion rail. You have this half orb. It's reminiscent of the world. It reflects the light with the fire that is replicated in the tongue of flame that serves as the handle. It speaks to the tongue of flame on the heads of the disciples during Pentecost. And so all of that is put into there in a very elegant, but yet also simple way. And, you can draw other meanings from it. And depending on your positioning within the church, or depending upon your viewpoint, I think from this viewpoint, only the pastor would ever get to see it this way, because the stained glass windows went down both sides. And sometimes, well, I shouldn't probably say this, but sometimes when my son Tim would throw his shoe at the pastor and he had to pick it up, we would see it that way. He was young. Yeah, right. Right. But both, in this case, both interpretations would be completely appropriate, right? So
Both interpretations completely appropriate. What's not appropriate is throwing your shoe at me while I'm trying to preach. Like throw that out there. Okay. Yeah. You're arming them. Yeah.
That's the danger. I apologize now, family. So. All right. So God reveals himself to us in tangible forms and in ways that get through to us by his actions. And so in the Old Testament, he was with them in that pillar of fire and in the cloud that, led them through the wilderness. And so in the life of Christ too, literally the acts of God here, how his healing, his touching, his suffering and dying, all of these things revealed God to us as much as his preaching did. And then also the eternal, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, is in a way that God reveals himself to us. And then also in the sacraments that we just talked about too. The word is inseparable from those physical elements, the bread and the wine, the water, those things that we touch and smell. So when we create liturgical art, it has to be, we come up with that meaning through this interrelationship between form. So how we organize the lines, the shapes, the colors, the textures, and also the content. What's the meaning behind this? And again, these meanings are always open to interpretation. So I wanted to show you an example of visual language. This is a church that was designed by Tadeo Ando. Apparently, he has become the architect for the rich and famous, but because of his simplicity. So his design is something that we would call very minimalist. Okay, there's not color in there. Everything has been pared down to the minimum to direct attention to the light. And so that light then, as it pours into the darkness of the sanctuary, it illuminates the walls and ceilings with a wash of light. The light emanates from the cross that takes up the whole wall. There are chairs for a leader up front, but there are a minimum of furnishings. There's maybe there's a small, simple table up there. The light moves into the congregation, much like the Holy Spirit lives in the hearts of the believers. And again, that idea of, what is the church? Well, we are the church, right? We are those. I was Listening to Pastor Dan's sermon today too, that verse in, built on the rock, we are God's house of living stones built for his own habitation. And I think that's so interesting that we build these buildings, but the church is really us, right? And I think we build the buildings for our convenience, as Pastor Will has talked about. And in that, we can have that focus for worship, but we are the church, right? So. The lack of furnishings then in this church then too focuses on how the light of God comes into the world. And in the book of John, chapter 1, the apostle writes how in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this Word is Jesus, and Jesus is the light. John goes on to write, he was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. So in this image in particular, I thought that was really interesting as I was looking through these two, that you see the light coming in through the cross. The cross is symbolizing Jesus, obviously, too. But through that, you can see the trees, and you see the sky, and you see the land, and the bushes, and the grass, and things like that. And so it also provides this contrast to the starkness inside. So this visual reminder of the void of the universe before creation. And then as Jesus was, involved with creation, how he brings that creation into the world. So Ando uses this technique in his building processes too, where the concrete isn't just this rough concrete that we would expect to feel, but if you were to touch the walls, it has a real softness to it. And it's based upon the way that he works with his forms. And so it's almost a silky feel to it too. And so if you ever want to see a Ando building, you don't have to go to Japan to see it, but you could go to St. Louis, and there's the Pulitzer Museum there, and it's built by the same architect, and the wall process is the same. You can still, feel that nice texture to it. But this is interesting too, how when we're thinking about this, if we're using the symbolism as a parable, think about this, how this is this transparent window to the other side. And this picture especially makes me think of that too. You are looking through, the light is coming through. There's movement both ways, right? In the way that we're looking at this.
Sir?
Yes.
Do you see that as a transitioning of the churches looking on the other side from the medieval ones in Europe where they were miles tall, instead of here where you open up to look to the earthly view on the outside?
I think it definitely has a different feel to it, right? I mean, the medieval churches had that way of building it so that they wanted to make you feel like you were in an elevated space, that you were in that transition between earth and heaven, not quite in the mud of earth, not quite in the glory of heaven. Whereas this, it really does, it is a different idea behind it, right? So it is more here and now. It is more about our relationship with Christ. It's more about, taking the ornamentation away, right? So I think that
So, yeah, I think
Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying.
yeah,
You look at it one way or you look at it the other way.
Yeah.
But it's the same objective.
right. Yep. So then, this church doesn't have those signs and symbols, but when we have and put signs and symbols within our churches, we have to remember and learn these, otherwise they're not of any value to us, right? So, when we're looking at this image of the lamb on the left, what types of things do you see there that we can recognize and talk about? What's going on in this one that we know that we should be reteaching? This is true. Go ahead.
There's a cross at the top, the banner has a cross,
Mhm.
little bottom things are a cross.
Right.
And the Lamb of God sits on the altar
Mhm.
with a crown.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right, okay, so, and definitely the crosses, we see them on there. What's another I know, again, let's go, what's another interpretation? What else is happening here?
Lamb is laid down.
Okay, so is the lamb in a sacrificial pose or is the lamb in a triumphant pose? Okay, and we know that because it's alive, he has the banner's triumphal, he has the nimbus, he has the halo, right? Okay, what's with these 7 things on the bottom of the book?
7 seals.
7 seals, right? Yep, 7 seals, and each of those seals were broken in Revelation, and the Lamb would read that section of the book, you know, so those things, again, are things that we should reteach, right? These symbols, so that if they have meaning or not, you know, so we see them on like, first visual level, right? And then we start to dig a little bit deeper. And again, within the artwork, this happens. When I show work to my students in class, that's the first thing we look at is what is the subject matter? And then how does that subject matter tell us something else? And so in this case too, we see the first things and then we think about, okay, well, what's the next thing? And oh, that does look like the book. Well, what that's about? And then hopefully, and I've said this before, and Pastor Will, I apologize now, but sometimes when during the pastor sermon, if I start to drift a little bit and I'm in church, I will look at things around there and oh, okay, so that's what that means. But you know, again, you know, I'm an artist. That's sorry. All right. Yes.
3 tails on that flag. Daddy, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
It very well could be. And so, and I'm going to admit sometimes, you know, if I don't know, I'm going to say, well, yes, it could be. And again, in contemporary art, your interpretation sometimes is just as valid as mine, right? But there are some times where you don't want to let everything open to that. But yes, it could be. And I think that would be, like I said with Rick too, that's a valid interpretation of what you see there, right? Okay, so I'm going to move on to this next one where things are definitely have this symbolism. And so Jan and I made this massively complex altar piece for the church. I'm not going to do this for us. I'm sorry. That's beyond my skill, and I'll admit it. I'll admit it. But 85 years before the Reformation, he painted this in 1432. And this is when it's fully open, and we see at the bottom Van Eyck's version of the Heavenly Feast of the Lamb. And so, again, everything is symbolic here, even to the point of, you know, and these are things that each time I look at it or read about it, I see more things to it too. But here is, you know, for instance, Cain and Abel's sacrifice right here. And then here is Cain putting Abel to death at the top, you know, and it's interesting to me though, too, that the sacrifice and the sin are next, you know, that the sin's next to Eve. Again, it's medieval thinking. I'm not trying to say anything about the ladies, but that's one of the things that, you know, that's where they happen to place that. But around there too, what I want to really focus in is this bottom section where they're at that feast of the Lamb. And so everybody's coming from all of the different compass points. They're all coming in to worship at that and worship before the Lamb. So you have this in the center, the Lamb is adored by the angels to the right and the left, where you have these 2 angels swinging these censers of incense next to the fountain of life. And if we go back to this other one, the fountain of life, and I should have showed this in the smaller picture too, but if you look down here, the fountain of life is, you know, filling with water. And then this water would, you know, has a track that would go down to make it look like it was actually dripping on the actual altar, which I think is really cool how the artist would do those things, put that in there. So then, you know, they're making that connection to how this fountain of life is present then right now, you know, into this actual altar that you have in your church, right? So, but on this one, it doesn't show it as much, but it does show something else really interesting. You have the Lamb, not like the Lamb we saw before, but this Lamb is still in this triumphant position. He's on top of the altar, but the blood is pouring into the chalice. And it's symbolizing this Eucharistic sacrifice of Christ. and its repeated celebration through the daily masses in the chapel where it would have been located. So underlining this concept of the Mass as the source of this eternal grace is that fountain of life then, and showing that through the sacraments, we have that life. So, but that symbol in the time that it was created before the Reformation creates some difficulty sometimes, right? So here you have the lamb as image and symbol changes according to what we have as beliefs too. So these are two prints made by Albrecht Dürer, who was a German artist. He became sympathetic to Luther's teachings and incorporated a lot of this into his artwork. So in the first image that was created before the Reformation, you see Christ as the central figure with John. And John is, laying over him. It must have been difficult for Christ to eat, but, it's showing that love that, Jesus had for him, right? But in the middle, you have this interesting remains of the Passover meal. So now, when you went and celebrated the Passover, you roasted this lamb, and then, here you have this lamb that looks like the meal has been sort of completed because it's the skeletal remains there. But that connection is still being made between Christ as the sacrificial lamb and the sacrifice occurring. And so this isn't, this is not, typical Catholic theology anymore, that during the Mass, Christ is sacrificed anew, but that concept of that sacrifice happening is there. And so, that concept of transubstantiation, though, the idea that the bread and wine are changed into the body and blood of Christ and remain the body and blood of Christ, are part of that thought that's going on in here too. And so the lamb remains to, I talked about that already. So on the front bench to the right, though, you also see Judas, which is kind of an interesting thing because here you have Judas, and it's Judas because he's got his bag here and he's holding that. And it's interesting that, again, symbolism, he's holding it in the left hand. The left hand is never seen to be a good thing, right? Even in the way that it was talked about or named. But he's holding that and he's about ready to go. But here's the controversy also. So people would look at this picture and say, did Judas, knowing that he had the evil in his heart, knowing he was going to betray Jesus, eat that first communion meal and then so eat himself to damnation? Okay, so again, controversy back then. I don't know that we necessarily, talk about that now. But on the next picture, if you look next to it, Judas is gone. And Judas is no longer there, but the lamb is no longer on the plate. The plate's empty. The sacrifice has been fulfilled. It has been completed. And next to it, Dürer puts the basket of bread and the flagon of wine. And so he puts that there to show us that the elements, instead of transubstantiation, it is now the in, with, and under. The bread and wine remain, but it is also changed in this mystical thing that we don't understand into the body and blood of Christ. So sometimes, though, if we teach what art means too well, the art becomes limited because we're less likely to interact with it ourselves. It may be that thing, well, Mr. Bergdolt said it was this, and well, what do you think? And it's like, so I don't want to do that either. It doesn't have to be just, my way of thinking. Because I may make something too where I think it's one way and you may see it the other way too. But good art shouldn't just soothe, but it should stimulate thought and it should stimulate discussion. Like we could have these discussions about how this works one way or the other. Good art shouldn't be escapist, and then Christianity isn't a sedative. We don't just want to lull ourselves to sleep and then not have anything that's going to make us think. And I think that's part of it too. So when we look at liturgical art, it should talk about the good news for all time, something that's, transcends time, but also something that is in a form that we can understand for our lives. And so a lot of times artists will turn to abstraction just because it's, depicting God, what does God really look like, can lead to some difficulties though too. So who gets to make liturgical art? Well, sinners, right? I mean, I'm a sinner, and I assume all of you are too, and if you say you're not, then, well, I think you may have just sinned, but anyway, no. But sinners who are redeemed by Christ, right? So, again, I talked about this earlier, sometimes I jump the gun like this, but, the objects for the tabernacle were set apart, they were consecrated, they were holy. And so the objects we make for the church are also set apart and made to be holy. So, but if you read further, just the very next chapter in the text, and so in our biblical interpretation classes, we were taught too, you don't just read, the chapter out of context, but you look to the next one. The very next chapter, the Israelites get too impatient waiting for Moses to come down the mountain. What do? They make the golden calf. They don't listen to God about these two guys who are supposed to make the stuff. They turn to Aaron and say, hey, you know how to craft things. Make us a calf, cover it with gold. And then they started to worship it. And so then all of those things that God had told Moses had to convince him not to destroy the people. He said, I'm going to build this tabernacle. Now I come down. And then God wants to kill everyone and make Moses a great nation. And Moses said, no, what will the people say about you? And so, it's just that interesting thing how things work. But I also talk about the definition of art and definition of things, of who gets to make these things. But it goes into Luther's concept of vocation. Some of us are called to be pastors and teachers. Some of us are called to make things. Some of us are called to work in other jobs. And those things are still, when we do our jobs, we honor God through that, right? And so the process that we go through when we're making liturgical art is different for each of us too. So I want to be careful to find someone who understands our beliefs so that we don't unintentionally send the wrong message. And so the more general the work, the more it could be built by anybody, right? And you could have like Teo Hondo, I don't think is Christian. I believe he's probably Buddhist or Taoist, one of the two, but he still makes an amazing Christian church, right? But the more specific you get, I would think that you should have your things pretty much locked in, otherwise you might, be leading someone astray. So, for instance, like, and I know I'm getting close to time here. I can tell, people start backing up. But for instance, the communion rail for years, when I was young, we started to have communion. The elders would come up and they would put up another rail in there so you couldn't get there. And I thought, oh, a physical barrier. I'm not supposed to be back there, right? Also when I was young, I was in a little church in Kansas and we had this ornately carved altar. It was made back in the 1880s, right? And so it had a sculpture of Jesus in the middle of it. And for the longest time, I was convinced that Jesus lived there. That was Jesus. And then I started to clean the church with my dad, and I noticed that there was a little door in the back of that altar, and I was really sure that Jesus lived in there, right? So, of course, being a child, and I opened up that door, and it had the Christmas decorations and all sorts of stuff. Okay, God doesn't live there. So, of course, being the know-it-all kid that I was, I told my classmates too, God doesn't really live in that altar, right? And so, but that's, you're getting here there. But, I know I'm kind of running out of time here too, but the one thing that I'll probably close with then is this one here. And Michelangelo Caravaggio, when he's creating work for the church, this was for the Counter-Reformation. The church was really trying to get people to come back to the Catholic Church after the Lutheran Reformation. But he creates a painting like this. It's very powerful. And but it does introduce things in that people were not accustomed to. So this is the Virgin Mary at her death. And you can tell that there's a green pallor to her face. So she's really dead, and so this was going against that tradition that Mary was assumed into heaven shortly after she died or assumed into heaven before she died. And that's still the teaching. And people, I looked it up and they said, yeah, they still teach it that way. It could be looked at one of the ways of that. But Caravaggio does this differently. So what are the people to think about it? This is different than what they have been taught. And so I think in some cases we do have to realize that as a designer, that A, we don't lead people astray, B, that we, are pretty up on what our meanings and our symbols do, and then C, create something that is really going to tell the message to people as they continue to interact with it as well. So next week, we're going to talk a little bit about our current setup here in faith. We're going to talk about the medieval church. And we're also going to talk about, I have that on a slide, but I can't remember it right now. But thank you for your attention. There will be a quiz next week.
Good.